Our first lesson comes from Isaiah chapter 5. It's verses 1 through 7. Listen now for the word of the Lord. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I am going to do with my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. Thanks be to God for the reading of his holy word.
Thank you, Abby. Well, we've kind of done a tour through John and some of these, well, all 8 of these sayings of Jesus, the I am sayings. The Giacometti's led us through them. Let's see if you can remember again. These are ways that Jesus said, I want you to get to know me. I want you to know how to relate to me. I want you to understand who I am in relationship to you. And he uses these figures of speech. The great I am. Before Abram was, I am. Associating himself with God the Creator. And I am the light of the world that enlightens everyone. Makes sense of this place that we live in. It says, I am the door that grants freedom. It leads into shelter and safety. It leads out to provision and recreation. I'm the way. He says, I'm the resurrection and the life. I'm like the way that you start over. I bring newness, even when there's lack of hope. Resurrection power that's there. I'm the bread of life, the good stuff that really sustains you and doesn't leave you constantly craving for more, but that satisfies. I'm the good shepherd. I know you by name, and I call you to lead you in the right ways. In fact, I'm the way itself, the way, the truth, and the life. Walk in this way that I'm teaching you. And today, this last one, he says, I am the true vine. I'm the true vine. Now, when he chose to use that metaphor, like Amanda suggested, he was evoking something that would have been commonplace for his disciples. We don't know that any of them were farmers or that any of them dressed grapevines. We don't know, but we do know this. They all drank wine. They all had seen vineyards. In fact, probably where they were that night of the Last Supper, they could see the grapevines on the hills over the walls of Jerusalem. And they probably walked alongside, if not among, grapevines on their way to the Garden of Gethsemane to keep watch with Jesus in his final night there. This was a common thing for them. And he says, I'm like that. So he tells this beautiful image, but it's an image that comes with a profound warning. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, but I invite you to follow along as we read the first 6 verses here. You'll find in the yellow sheet in your bulletin passages from John 15. We're going to read now just 1 through 6. Jesus speaking, he says, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch that bears no fruit. While every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes it so that it will be even more fruitful. And you are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. So remain in me, as I also remain in you. For no branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. Because I'm the vine and you're the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, then you'll bear much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. And if you don't remain in me, well, you're like a branch that's thrown away and it withers. And such branches are picked up, thrown in the fire, and burned. Well, there's an invitation an evocative thing of a cluster of grapes and a vine and branches, and yet with a stern warning. He's using an image that isn't just familiar to the landscape around them, but also from the tradition they came from. You heard Abby read from Isaiah chapter 5, singing a song of a vineyard. And it's a vineyard that God likens to his people, Israel. And he says, I've planted you, you have made you a people, I've appointed you to bear fruit, and what have you done? I look for a good harvest, but I find only bad. He said, I look for justice, but I see only bloodshed. I look for righteousness, but I heard cries of distress. Therefore, the vineyard itself will be trampled. Well, Jesus picked up Isaiah, and at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he retold that same parable, or he turned it into a parable. It's a song of words of the prophet Isaiah. He uses as a parable. Let me read to you what he says in Matthew 21. Well, let me paraphrase it, rather. He says this, there was once a landowner who planted a vineyard, and in it he planted the choicest of vines. He built a wall around it, and he dug a wine press in it, and he even built a watchtower over it. So, fully appointed. And then he rented the vineyard out to tenants who grew their grapes. And when the harvest came, he sent his servants to collect a portion of the land. Well, the tenants were not willing to yield anything. And so it says, of the 3 servants that came, they beat one, they stoned one, and they killed another. Well, when word reached the landlord, what happened? He sent more servants. And the parable says they treated them just as badly as the first group. So then the landowner says this, I know what I'll do. I'll send my own son. Surely they will respect him. But the parable says, no, they didn't. They threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. And then Jesus turns to the crowd and he asks, what do you think the landlord will do now? And they reply, they will put those wretches to a wretched end. That's what he'll do. He'll take the vineyard away from those tenants and give it to someone who can not only tend it, but to yield to God what's his. Jesus is, I think, referring back to this, not in a scary way, but in a way that he wants it to be hopeful for disciples. But he does give them a warning. He says, listen, the reason I'm here is for change. God is not content to let his creation just veer off course. He's not content to let humans made in his own image go to ruin, following their own impulses of selfishness and greed until they kill each other and mess up the natural order. He says, no, I'm going to intervene, and I want that to be effective. I want that to bear fruit. And if it doesn't bear fruit, well, then you're of no use, really. You're like a branch, a fruitless branch. It's clipped off. He doesn't say it's thrown in the fire because the landlord is interested in tormenting the branches. No, they're just not helpful. So they're eliminated. And the ones who do abide, they get to remain and continue to produce good stuff. So his challenge to them is simply this. The job of a branch is to stay connected to the vine. Or in his words, in the word, the NIV that we read, it says, remain in me. I like what the King James and the New American Standard says, abide in me. Stay in me. Stay attached. Stay connected to me. That's your job. And if you do that, then the fruit will be produced. Now, if branches on a grapevine had eyes, or if they had hands, or if they had a center of attention, I think it would be pointed towards the vine, not towards the fruit. Jesus says, you pay attention to me, you stay connected to me, and that stuff will grow. That will be the outcome of it. Don't worry about what's growing over here. You worry about staying connected. Abide in me, and my words in you. Or as he says, abide in my love, as I've abided in the Father's love. And then you will produce fruit. It'll come. That'll grow. A friend of mine who teaches spiritual formation likes to put it this way. if you connect and make that your concern, connecting with Christ, well, then he will perfect the fruit of your life. He'll take care of that. You worry about abiding, staying in. Jesus uses these metaphors, a lot of agricultural metaphors, about what the kingdom of God is like. And the kingdom of God is the place where God's rule is effective, where God's commands are obeyed, the place where his instructions are followed, and the fruit of those instructions are healed. One metaphor is like this. He says it's like a little mustard seed. It's a tiny little thing. You plant it, but it grows up to be one of the largest shrubs in the garden, enough so that birds can perch in its branches. Or he says it's like yeast, a tiny little thing, almost invisible when it gets in the dough, but it has consequences everywhere. And one parable, agricultural image that nobody ever commentates on, but it's one of my favorite ones. Let me read it to you from Mark 4. He says this: "This is what the kingdom of God is like. It's like a man who scatters some seed on the ground, and night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed goes about doing its thing. It sprouts and it grows, even though the farmer knows not how. All by itself, the soil produces the grain, first the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel." We don't know how to do it. And I think Jesus is saying this: stay connected, and that stuff will take care of itself. There's a way of reading this parable of the vineyard and the tenants that can drive us towards anxious activity, productivity. Jesus wants us to be productive, right? My job is to be productive. I need to be about doing good. And he says, yeah, I do want you to be productive, but the way to that is connecting with me. I want to take a look here, if you will, at that yellow sheet that I printed from John 15, if you got a bulletin there. And you'll see that there's kind of a golden braid of how this all interweaves together. And I would suggest this might be a good thing to take with you and meditate on. Maybe try to follow these different threads that weave in and out. They wrap around each other, almost like a vine wrapping around a trellis. Beginning with verse 9. It says this: "As the Father has loved me, so I love you, so now remain in my love. And if you keep my commandments, then you will remain in my love, just as I kept my Father's commandment and remain in his. And I told you this, so that my joy can be in you, and that your joy can be complete. And this is my command: love each other, just as I have loved you. And greater love is no one than this, that he lays down his life for one's friends. And you're my friends if you do what I command. I don't call you servants. A servant doesn't know what the master's business is, but instead I call you friends. For everything I've learned from my Father I've made known to you. You didn't choose me. I chose you and I appointed you, that you go and bear fruit, and fruit that will last. So whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. And this is my command, that you love one another." You see how those things of God's love, abiding in love, following the command, loving one another, resulting in our joy, all weave one and around in each other. You know, John's gospel, an interesting thing about John's gospel, it is filled with high-flying theology, even from the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. But when it comes down to it, it's not about abstract theology or metaphysics. It's so simple. We might say this, that the entire word of Jesus, the entire good news that he has come to share, can be summarized this way: remain in God's love and pass that love on to others. That's simple. That's simple. Remain in God's love and share that love with others. Now, it's simple, but it's not easy. It's not easy for me because so much of the time I don't know how to abide in God's love. My view of myself is that I'm not worthy of God's love. Can't quite believe it. It's a little uncomfortable to learn to be loved, to learn to be an object of God's affection. It's a big thing to learn. Simple, but not easy for some of us. And the other half of that is, and if you abide in that, the natural consequence, the thing that just happens, just like grapes grow off the end of a grapevine, so too you will love one another. And you will abide in my love, and I will abide in you, and you will love your neighbors, and you will know the joy I have come for you to know. That's it. It's pretty revolutionary. There's a lot of answers that are out there in the world of what we need, what the world needs, what the way forward is. And Jesus says this, come to me and learn to be loved by God. Follow me and learn to love the way I've loved you. It's that simple. If somebody asks you, well, tell me about Church in the Cove, why do you go there? You might mention the great music. You might mention a beautiful maple tree. You might mention the coffee that we don't get to drink anymore in the afternoon. But if they ask you, well, I'm asking, but what's it really about? A good answer would be, we're walking together following Jesus, learning to abide in God's love and to love others too. It's that simple. Revolutionary as it is. What does it mean to love others? Does it really work in the practical world? I will tell you a story from a war about George Washington, actually, a general founder of the country, right? He had a prisoner in his care, a guy named Michael Wildman. And was a guy, he was a minister early in his life, and he became an inn owner. But from the time of the Declaration of Independence, he became a patriot and covertly was helping the cause of the American Revolution. He owned a little inn out in Cocalico, in eastern Pennsylvania. But he also had kind of a loose mouth. And General Howe, the British general over Philadelphia, sent some spies out to that area of Pennsylvania because he knew that the Revolutionary Army was getting support from somewhere, somehow. And when those spies were there, they heard Wildman making kind of unflattering comments about the British general. And so took exception, and they pursued him at gunpoint. He knew that he was in trouble with the Brits now, so he hid. And he hid out with a group of monks of sorts, the Rusconians, who are these folks in Ephra, Pennsylvania, who were kind of a combination of, if you think of shape, something like that. But he hid among them until he was so troubled of spirit that the Brits would find him, execute him. He made his way to Philadelphia. He said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to confront General Howe and beg for mercy. And more than that, I will promise to be his spy. I'll tell him what the Revolutionary Army is doing. So that's what he did. He heads off to Philadelphia, gets an audience with General Howe. Howe finds him a rather despicable man and sends him away. But he had told his wife ahead of time what he was doing, and he turned out to be more of a patriot than him. So she tells the commanders in the Revolutionary Army, my husband is betraying you. He's given the enemy what your moves are. He's telling where your cash is. So as soon as he's released from Howe, he is captured by the Continental Army and taken to George Washington. He's tried and found guilty of treason. Well, now back in Ephra is an acquaintance of his, a guy named Philip Miller. They knew each other because Philip Miller had been the minister of the Reformed German Church in Germantown before Budman was. And he left that church because he got attracted to stuff going out at Ephra. The Rosicrucians. He wanted to study with them. He left, became a pacifist, and became what amounts to an abbot of this religious order of pacifist scholars and ministers. Well, Weinman hated him. He thought that his abandoning the Reformed understanding of faith was unforgivable. So every opportunity he had, every time he saw Philip Miller in public, he would spit in his face. If he had an opportunity to trip him in a public way, he would do so. Once he bloodied his face with a punch to his nose. So when Miller heard that this acquaintance, this thorn in his flesh, was being held by George Washington and was sentenced to be hung in the morning, on foot he set out from Ephra to Valley Forge, a walk on foot overnight. And he shows up, he gets an audience with the general, and he says, I've come to plead for this man's life. I want you to forgive him. And Washington says, well, I'm quite impressed that you would walk all this way overnight for the sake of your friend, but he's a traitor to our cause and he must die. To which Philip says, he is not my friend. He's perhaps my worst enemy. But the Lord I follow teaches us to love our enemies. The Lord who died for your behalf, General Washington, is the one who commands such love. And the historic record says this, that in the presence of his men, with tears in his eyes, George Washington said, "You're right. That is the command for us." And he let him go. There were punishments. He lost his lands and had some other restriction. His life was saved. You know, we don't have to go back to revolutionary time or think of acts like that, of treason and execution and last-minute stays. We can just look around. Even here, you know, there are folks who make deep personal sacrifices of love to care for ailing parents, to give attention. But that's abiding in God's Christ's love and just passing that love on to others. It's that simple. Here's my challenge for you this week. Take that yellow sheet with you. Find a couple of times throughout the week to prayerfully read it again and ask God these two simple things. Lord, help me abide in your love. Teach me more to abide in your love. And secondly, give me opportunities this week to pass that love on to others. Jesus said, when you do these things, you will abide in me and so prove to be my disciples. Not only that, but your joy will be full. Let's do that for the sake of this world and for our own joy. Let's pray.